Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to my lecture. So today we are going to discuss about more in details about macroeconomic elements in public policy discussion, especially when we look at public policy from economics lens. So always some of the macroeconomic indicators or the components are very important, which we really need to understand. And then we also try to see that what are the impacts on those indicators or components while framing the policy. So in our last discussion, we spoke about the grand macroeconomic equations, and then we also discussed about all the macroeconomic broad components like output like Y, and then consumption expenditures, and investment expenditures, government expenditures, and then export and import in case of open economy. So we also spoke about the simple equation like when output Y equals to C plus I without government expenditures, and how it looks like when tax is included, because the moment tax gets included, then income we see from the disposable income, and then its impact on the total output will be changing. So that we have understood. We also discussed about the tax multiplier and also government multipliers, and then in our last discussion we stopped showing that balanced budget multiplier, where we had shown that equal amount of changes of equal amount of government expenditure or the taxes, that also has the equal effect changes in the total output. So today just let's begin our discussion while talking to deficit and surpluses in budget, because this is very everyday sort of macroeconomic debates and language that we always hear as a student of economics. Is like budget deficits and budget surplus. So what does that mean? So budget surplus, in case of budget surplus, this is an excess of total government tax revenue collections, like total T that we already introduced. And then if you recollect that we generally we in our last discussion we kind of put our equation, we kind of had kept our equation like this, like C plus I plus G, and then we expanded this, and then it was like C A my plus B Y minus T, because this B is multiplier which is consumption multiplier. How did we define? If you recollect, we have defined as marginal propensity to save, and then here investment, in this particular case investment we considered as a fixed, which is planned investment, and then we have government expenditure. So here if you remember, there are two components that government can actually intervene with in the economy. So one is of course the tax government expenditures G, and then another one is tax like capital T. So here when we are saying budget surplus, here is like total government tax revenue, like T will be excess, like is more than total government expenditure, which is G, right? So T has to be higher than G. So now the next point, that budget deficit, in the budget deficit is like an excess of government expenditure, is just the opposite case that we discussed just now in case of budget surplus. In budget deficit is basically government expenditure G is higher than total tax, like mostly total tax that government collect is like tax revenue will be lower than the total government expenditure. Means government has more commitment towards the expenditure or spending than the tax collections. So when we talk about budget surplus, like generally we denote as a plus sign, and then deficit we denote as a negative sign. In budget surplus or budget deficit, the way in which we write is like T minus G. So ideally tax revenue has to be higher than the government expenditure, and then it will be positive. If it is negative, then certainly it is deficit. So this T is like tax collection, tax revenue, and then government expenditure could be whatever the government that they spend, government spending on various infrastructural projects including roads, schools and highways, and also health, and also a lot of money that governments borrow in case of deficit financing. So government also borrows money, government takes loan from different international funding agencies, and then the rate of interest that will be there in order to give the return on the loan. So those will be coming as a part of the government expenditures. So this is quite obvious, like if somebody take the loan, and then rate of interest has to be part of the expenditure, and then here also the same case, like when government borrows money or takes loan, then interest of the return on loan will be considered as government expenditure. So this is what we really need to understand much more carefully when we talk about deficits and surpluses in the budget itself. So that is important. So now deficit financing, counter and pro-cyclical policy, that here we can actually talk about a bit. We can spend a bit time here. So what is deficit financing? So government spending in excess of tax revenue collected. So that is what deficit financing is. Counter cyclical policy is a policy is a part of the fiscal policy. One thing that we have to remember, that so far we are talking about fiscal policy, and fiscal policy deals with broad fiscal markets, and where we actually understand goods and services from the transactions point of view, and there we talk about aggregate demand, and basically in fiscal policy or fiscal market we talk about consumption expenditures, government expenditures, tax, and then investment expenditures. So counter cyclical policy is a fiscal policy, the type of fiscal policy in which taxes are lowered. So that is very important to remember. A tax is low, the taxes is lowered by the government, and expenditure is raised. So taxes is lowered and government expenditure is high when economy is weak. So this is quite obvious. I think there is no further explanation required. It's quite self-explanatory, but still imagine the situation where recession is happening, or say recent past COVID-19. During COVID-19, pre and post, I mean just during and post COVID, and if you compare with the pre-COVID situation, you can actually clearly see that what we are actually talking in terms of counter cyclical policy. So there, for the investment point of view, tax was lowered so that economy can be boosted, and government expenditure was very high in order to increase the total aggregate demand, and therefore say investment on the more investment on the road infrastructure, or investment expenditure on government expenditure on Manrega, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So government spent a lot of money there, and so that reverse migration that we witnessed, especially in case of India, and also rural economy, the unemployment, those were actually tackled during during COVID-19. So when we see the economy is weak, so this is the tendency for the fiscal policy, and fiscal policy through fiscal policy, tax gets lowered, and also expenditure, government expenditure is raised. So this is what counter cyclical. But in counter cyclical, this is one part of counter cyclical. The second part, which says like exactly the opposite, like when economy is strong, then tax is high, and then government expenditure is low. So this is again I think self-explanatory. So this is called counter cyclical policy. So now in order to respond to this, there is another one policy is like pro-cyclical policy. Again, types of fiscal policy. A, like another situation where taxes are lowered, expenditure is again high, like government expenditure is raised when the economy is strong. So even in case of economy, the situation where economy is weak, but then tax revenue, tax collection is lower and government expenditure is high. So that is, we can understand that in order to give the push to the economy, so that economy can be boomed and can be reboosted. So we can understand that through this total aggregate demand will be increased. But then in pro-cyclical, in the case of A, like when tax is again lowered and expenditure is raised, but in case of strong economy, so there here like mainly government is trying to, like still government expenditure is high, but then despite economy is strong, so we can say by looking at the business, for instance business point of view, like in order to encourage business, or in order to even support poor policies. So even government economy, if economy is strong, that means economy can actually afford to spend more and more, and that is what pro-cyclical policy that we try to understand that through expansionary fiscal policy. When government has resources, government is supposed to spend more, and then tax is lowered. So that part is like just to encourage encourage small, medium and large business to invest more and more, so that again ultimate objective is to increase overall aggregate demand. So aggregate demand, how aggregate demand can be raised either through counter cyclical policy or pro-cyclical policy. So now let's try to understand aggregate demand and rate of interest. What is the role and the relationship between these two? So far, investment, the way we try to understand investment is through fixed planned investment. So investment is basically the new machineries for production. So in production function, investment becomes very important. So animal spirit, what we understood is like we assume investment is exogenous, but then now to argue on that, to counter argue on that, that investment and interest, like farm borrows, like it is not always that farm will have the savings or somewhere that farm can actually, or investor can invest from his or her own. So in this particular case is like when farm borrow money for investment from financial institutions, bank issues bond with rate of interest. So here a higher rate of interest, then higher cost of money. So here two things that we have to remember. So rate of interest, when we as savers, when we go to the bank with the money to keep the money in the bank, then we always look for the high return. So rate of interest is when it is high, so return will be, expected return will be high, and therefore the value of the money for present value of the money that from individuals, from the household side, it is like is high. But then when from the borrower's point of view, this rate of interest is like, if rate of interest is very high, then cost of the borrowing will be very high, and then value of the money for the borrower will be very less. So that's the features of the rate of interest that we really need to understand here. So but in particular case we are talking about borrowings or borrowers point of view, like in case of borrowers, what is the relationship between investment and rate of interest, and looking at the value of the money, and then lower incentive for the firms to invest. So if rate of interest very high, then investment, like borrowing money for investment purposes will will be low. So here we see that in case of investment, actual investment in aggregate demand function, this rate of interest and investment, they are inversely related. So if we can plot just like the way we plotted consumptions and income, here if we can plot, if we want to understand investment and rate of interest, their functional relationship, and if we measure I is a say small I is rate of interest and capital I is the investment. So the way it is, like if rate of interest increases, then cost of borrowing will be high, and then for firms it will be discouraging factor to invest more, and therefore this is negatively related. And vice versa, if rate of interest is low, then cost of borrowing will be low, and then firms investment will be high. So it is a negative relationship. So in equations form, that we can write like, now the total I, like capital grand I, like investment, will be can be written as equals to I naught. I naught is say planned investment, which is fixed along with the across the time. So it's a fixed investment. The other one, which is depending on the rate of interest, here R. So we mention small I here, but then small I or small r. So it's like rate of interest. So another investment is like total, it will be depending on rate of what kind of rate of interest are there in the bank, and that is how the cost of borrowing will be calculated, and then investment will be taken place accordingly. So in aggregate demand context, especially in the fiscal policies perspective, so 2 points are very important, especially when we talk about public policy in case of say demand and savings and investment. Is like, one is crowding out, the other one is crowding in. So here it depends when how government expenditure spend and how private investment is spending. So let us assume, since we have already introduced the concept of investment and also the concept of say rate of interest. So here say rate of interest either small r or small I, and then here like say savings and so in the household, just one more assumption that we are supposed to know, and I'm just reiterating again. So just to recollect, like savings and investment. So whatever the whatever the amount of money will be saved in the financial institutions, then that needs to be invested in the farm, or farm can be borrowed from that. So this is the equilibrium conditions where savings becomes equals to investment, right? So let's see, this is the say private investment. Here say government investment, and here say this is the supply of goods and services. So you can see here, say here rate of interest was say 5%, and here say it is the unit savings of the amount of borrowing, or we can also consider like this is getting reflected in the output. So even from the outputs point of view, let's say 100 units here, and then this is one equilibrium, say equilibrium A, where say I1 I1 is intersecting at total savings at A, and then another one is like after raising the government's investment. So government government is spending, so government investment has taken place, and therefore this investment including government expenditure has increased, and this is what we get the new equilibrium point. And you can see rate of interest has increased like say 5 to 7%, but then in this equilibrium we get say 150 units of the savings or borrowing, whatever the amount that we are talking about here. So now 2 points here. So with if rate of interest is keeping at lower rate like at 5, then at this point through the government investment, in fact borrowing or savings can take place up to 200 units, right? So this is what keeping rate of interest low and including both government expenditure, government investment and private investment. But since rate of interest, in reality, since rate of interest has increased and then actual investment or savings or borrowing is going low to say 100 to 80 units, and this is due to increase in the rate of interest, and therefore private investor will be crowding out, and through their crowding out from the investment, so this reduction in the total savings or borrowing is taking place like 100 minus 80, which is 20 units. So this particular crowding out that we are talking about, like this movement from A to A double dash. So here this is the movement of the crowding out movement, crowding out movement is A to A double dash. The output is an output loss that we get, like especially in savings or borrowing, the amount that are getting crowded out from the economy is like 100 to 80, which is 20. And if we want to crowd in, then of course we can retain with the rate of interest, lower rate of interest at say I at 5, and then in crowding in situations, then economy will get expanded, and then total output will be 200. So that is what crowding in movement is basically A to B, and the output is basically 200 minus, like 200 minus 100 is basically 100 that we are talking about. So this part will also discuss like crowding out and crowding in. This part will discuss more in details when we even talk about investment savings and ALM curve, like when we bring fiscal policy and monetary policy together. In other words, when we bring fiscal market and monetary market together, and then we'll see that how investment takes place much more in details. So but then from here, like from investment and from savings point of view, one can also discuss, because saving, in any case, savings is a function of income, and therefore as saving increases, therefore output also will be increased. So savings can also be considered as one of the proxy variable for the total output. Just to continue, like what investment function that we already discussed, there I equals to I naught minus BR, or small I, like rate of interest. It doesn't matter. So now let us understand how we can actually formulate, or how we understand the overall grand macroeconomic equations. Here, like say small c, as we know, already we know c equals to a plus by, and we are keeping it overall income. So a plus by plus I. Now I is like here, I is I naught, like planned, minus, we can say C I. So I naught minus C I plus government expenditure. So here we can write Y minus by, and here B is marginal propensity to consume. Here A plus I naught plus G. So these are all constant. A is autonomous consumptions, which is fixed, like certain amount of consumption is fixed. I naught is a planned investment, which is fixed. Government expenditure is also known. We can also consider this a fixed, minus CI, and small c is the investment multiplier, which actually shows the functional relationship between investment and rate of interest. So that is the coefficient that we are trying to understand, like how what is the effect of investment, effect on investment due to changes in the rate of interest. So that is precisely a C, and the negative is basically denoting the relationship between I and small I, capital I and small I. So here Y will be A plus I naught plus G multiply by 1 minus B. We are bringing 1 minus B from here, and C by 1 minus B, and here small I. So this is what you can we can see, like this is equilibrium output. So we can write that this is equilibrium output, which is depending on all the constant factors and positively related to with, because this entire value I naught, G and B all are positive, like all are greater than 0. And if all are positive, then the first component on the right hand side is positive, and therefore this all constant, like all the coefficient or autonomous components, these are, once they increase, then total output will increase. But then total output is negatively related with the income, because here C and B both are greater than 0. That means Y and I both are negatively related. So in sum, we can say that Y and I both are negatively related. So now from the result, like note that equilibrium output is negatively related to rate of interest. Higher rate of interest, like if I is high, less investment. So less investment, that we already know. Once I decreases from here, like say this is grand equation, if I decreases, then this is aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will, or say equals to, is decreases, and decreases the equilibrium overall output. So this is quite obvious, that we will also discuss in our discussion. So I stop here. I have shown that relationship between total output, equilibrium output, and the rate of interest, how they are related. So now in our next class, we'll talk about IS and IS curve. and I's equation. I stands for investment and S stands for savings. So now we'll try to bring investment and savings together, although we already brought investment and savings together in order to showing crowding in and crowding out effect, but then we'll discuss from the fiscal policies and fiscal markets point of view through IS curve. So I stop here, and these are the two references that I have used, Mankiw and Freund, to explain the aggregate demand and then the equilibrium output and rate of interest. For further examples and then for further explanations, I would request you to go through these two references. So thank you very much for your attentions, and I'll see you in my next class.